am an the Wisconsin Cancer Collaborative. Today's webinar is the challenges of rapidly developing and distributing COVID-19 vaccines. Today, this call is being recorded, and if you experience technical difficulty, feel free to use the chat for assistance or the help options within Zoom. We are delighted to have so many new people join us today, along with our existing members. For those of us who may not be as familiar with us, we are the Wisconsin Cancer Collaborative, Wisconsin's statewide comprehensive cancer coalition comprised of 140 organizations working together to reduce the burden of cancer for everyone in Wisconsin. If you are not yet a member, we'd love to have you join. Membership is free. If you are interested in joining, you can do so at the link on the screen. This is today's agenda. We'll do a brief welcome, and then we will have a presentation by Dr. James Conway, with time at the end for questions and discussion. We are so thrilled to have Dr. James Conway as our presenter this month. Dr. James Conway is a professor in the Department of Pediatrics, Division of Infectious Diseases. His primary area of interest is centered on vaccine development and strengthening immunization programs, both domestic and international. He is the medical director for UW Health Immunization Programs and is currently providing oversight for UW Health COVID-19 vaccine logistics, including storage and prioritization, as well as serving in the Emergency Operations Committee for the University of Wisconsin system. He is involved in multiple COVID-19 vaccine development programs, as well as serving on the Wisconsin State Medical Advisory Committee for COVID-19 vaccines. And with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Conway. I will stop sharing my screen and I will let you pull up yours.
Great, thank you so much. Does that come across okay?
Yes, it looks good. Thank you.
Perfect. All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us, and nice to see so many familiar names here. What I'm going to do is just briefly, at this kind of 1-year anniversary of the start of this whole mess that we're in, kind of quickly walk through how we actually got to where we are involving vaccines, vaccine development, and then talk a little bit about where we are with vaccine distribution. But I want to leave it some time for questions and comments from the crew here as well. So, I think everybody will remember that although this seems like it's been a 5-year ordeal, this all started last year around the holidays with the first reports of these atypical pneumonia cases, and then confirmation of a novel virus back in the beginning of January. Now, we know now that this has been circulating certainly back into probably September and October based on actual cancer specimens in Italy from lung cancer patients with stored serum, suggesting that although this was first recognized in Wuhan, this may have been circulating previous to that. Remarkably, within just a few weeks, the Chinese were actually able to sequence the entire virus and publish this in the New England Journal, which is really what got us a head start on being able to so rapidly develop vaccines. First case was identified outside of China in Thailand, which is near and dear to my heart as I teach there almost every May. And just to give a contrast for how different public health systems have dealt with this, Thailand in the last year, in a country of 65 million, has only had about 4,000 cases total over the entire year, with only a couple of hundred deaths. So I think you can see the difference in a strong public health system that's organized and coordinated versus how much of the rest of the world has gone. By the middle of March, this was obvious that this had become a pandemic, which meant that it had reached multiple continents. And that's when we all went into the safer at home guidance that was issued in the middle of March. And so what this represented was yet another version of a coronavirus that had leapt from bats into an intermediary host and then into humans. And so at least we had some experience with SARS-CoV-1 and with MERS-CoV in understanding a little bit about these coronaviruses. Now, what have we figured out from a clinical standpoint? Well, we know that this is a multi-organ system disease with many people having milder disease, but a constellation of symptoms that are more expansive than what you expect to see with most respiratory viruses, suggesting that there is not only a high-grade viremia that affects multiple organs, but also that there is a activation of the immunologic system leading to a lot of secondary collateral damage that I'll talk about in a little bit. So this is basically what we figured out about the course of COVID-19 infection. So we have this incubation period that ranges between 3 and 10 days. Originally was thought to be as long as 14 days, which is why the initial quarantine periods were a little bit longer. Then for the majority of people, an acute mild phase illness that lasts for somewhere between 5 and 10 days. And then for the majority of people, improvement from that. However, there is a small but important population that goes through this acute respiratory distress syndrome and then the cytokine storm, which leads to this really extensive multi-organ disease, eventually recovery for those that survive. However, then we see these post-infectious inflammatory concerns, either the MIS-C disease in children, multisystem inflammatory syndrome, or these people that have long hauler disease where they have prolonged fatigue and prolonged organ damage and sometimes neurologic issues. How does this all look? You know, just to briefly walk through it, obviously a viral entry and viral replication in host cells, and then you have an immune response that is fairly prototypic for viral responses in that it's led by lymphocytes, but also with some contribution in the inflammatory cascade to some of the other cells. You then get this sort of ongoing inflammation in the blood vessels. And so a lot of the damage to the organs and a lot of the complications happen from this ongoing inflammation and procoagulant effect that happens in many of the blood vessels, both lungs and elsewhere. And then obviously in that very severely affected population, as that inflammatory cascade gets worse and worse, you start to get leakage of these blood vessels in addition to thrombi, and then you get pulmonary edema and edema throughout the body, and eventually organ damage. So when we break it down, whoops, sorry about that. You know, the majority of people, about 80%, are going to end up with mild or asymptomatic disease or no pneumonia whatsoever. About 14% are going to end up with primarily pulmonary involvement. And then you get this 5% that really go into this multi-system organ failure. And what we've discovered over this year is that there are significant comorbidities leading to people having much more severe versions of these infections. Obviously, age and immune senescence, as people get older, their immune systems are less capable of dealing with these things. And what we've seen is basically any underlying condition that affects the wellness of the heart and lungs, the small blood vessels where a lot of these microvascular events, clotting and the like happen, or people that have immunologic defects or immunologic disruptions where the immune response is even more chaotic than it is even in a normal person as they respond to this infection. The list of individuals who are considered at increased risk of severe illness, and this is in the exact order that's on the CDC site. You can see the cancer is the top of the list here of individuals who are at increased risk of severe illness. And I think this is largely a combination of things, including the fact that they often already have some impact based on either their primary or their treatment on the heart and lungs and small blood vessels, as well as significant immune disruption that can lead to all sorts of variants in how their immune system responds to this. But you can see on down the list here, basically anything that impacts the wellness of heart, lungs, blood vessels, or the immune system will lead to, in many cases, more severe illness. With this last year, we've also had a tremendous effort in trying to figure out treatments for these things. And the FDA has been hard at work, as we would expect, in helping plan and develop drug treatment protocols, reviewing multiple trials, and have authorized 5 treatments for emergency use and 1 fully authorized treatment at this point. And there's a wide array of these types of treatments that are being explored: many antivirals, cell and gene therapy, immune modulators, monoclonal and other neutralizing antibodies, and various other modalities or combinations of these things. So people are really and have been very, very intent on trying to figure out how to manage this. But I think we also very quickly realized that, as with many things in the American medical system, while we're pretty good at treatment, the money is really at the prevention level. And so, you know, you do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, you do better. And certainly we've realized that while designing better treatment protocols is helpful, really where the intensive efforts need to be placed is on prevention. And our prevention efforts initially were unfortunately a little chaotic as well, because in the beginning, most of the public health authorities assumed that this would act much more like most respiratory viruses, where the masking is primarily of benefit when there's an ill person who might be transmitting to others, but that there's less benefit for those that are actually wearing masks that are non-infected. And so the emphasis was really on hand hygiene and surface cleaning, people that were sick staying home, and then the beginnings of this social distancing. But within a few months, it was recognized that aerosols were actually more significant than they are for many other respiratory viruses. And so the recommendations had to pivot to more routine masking for both, for all individuals because of the high degree of asymptomatic transmission that was out there, as well as the recognition that high-risk individuals would benefit perhaps from improved personal protective equipment. And obviously we then had to move also into limiting indoor contact, limiting group sizes, and more attention to air circulation. But there was no question rather early on that the exit ramp to this wild ride we are on had to be in eventually developing herd immunity, with vaccines being the primary path to that. So let's talk a little bit about what we already knew about coronaviruses as we started to try to develop vaccines. So coronaviruses are extraordinarily common. Probably somewhere between 5 and 15% of respiratory illnesses every winter are caused by coronaviruses. They're common enough that when you do large serosurveys of populations, about 90% of adults over the age of 90 have coronavirus antibodies, and about 60% of kids. So these are ubiquitous viruses that are everywhere. We also know, though, that the immunity from these actually wanes rather quickly. And so within just a few months, mucosal immunity, which is really what's important for protecting against these kind of respiratory viruses, has diminished to the point where less than 30% of people are found to still have detectable secretory antibodies. And that's why reinfection by these viruses is so very common. We do know that the previous versions of these more severe coronaviruses, SARS and MERS at least, did have more persistent immunity. And so there was some hope that there would be an option for developing something that would be better than wild type infection. So as we looked at ideal vaccine candidates, and as we look at any vaccine, there's basically two components to the discussion. Does it work and is it safe? And so when we looked at looking for what was going to be the marker of efficacy we would need to approve vaccines, we needed immunity that was actually long-lasting and probably superior to wild-type infection, that was long-lasting and that would hopefully be easily boosted, either by exposure to the virus itself in people that are already immunized, or that can be boosted readily when booster doses may be required or updated vaccines may be required. I wish I knew how to turn all this pinging off. We also want a vaccine that'll not only prevent severe disease and hospitalizations, but also would ideally prevent asymptomatic infections and transmission and shedding. We want something that would activate not only B cells that'll give you antibodies, but also T cells, which are really much more important for memory immunity. And then obviously on the safety side of it, we want something that does not enhance the immune response. In other words, that doesn't lead to the cytokine cascade when people are infected, or doesn't lead to inflammatory changes later that would mimic this MIS-C disease we see in children. And while this may seem like something that would be a theoretical concern, there have been at least 2 vaccines that were developed, the dengue vaccine and the RSV vaccine, that both actually did cause enhanced immune disease. In other words, those that had received the vaccine actually had much worse disease when they got infected by those viruses than if they had never been vaccinated. So this was one of the significant concerns, and obviously then minimal side effects and no long-term side effects. So here's our friend, the SARS-CoV-2 virus in a schematic. And what this basically represents is, what did we think about when we were starting to look at targets for vaccines? And when you look at targets, you're looking at structural components of the virus, ideally that are easily, quote unquote, seen by the immune system and that are relatively stable. And so most of the early discussions focused on these spike glycoproteins, these pink things here, which over many years of previous research on coronaviruses had been shown to be quite stable and readily presented to the immune system. And you can see where the name coronavirus comes from, because it's named after the corona, or the crown around the sun. And so that's part of the reason that these things are named the way they are, is that these things look like crowns to people that are molecular biology people. But you can also see that there are a lot of other antigenic regions on these things. And so future iterations, future generations of vaccine very well could be like influenza vaccines, where we have some H components and some N components for the A viruses. You're all familiar with H1N1 or H5N1. We could get to the point where we have multivalent vaccines that actually act against multiple components of these viruses. But with that said, all of the 200 plus vaccines that are in various stages of development have been primarily focused on this spike glycoprotein, which seemed like a great idea until recently, as we've started to see the emergence of some of these mutations, where these mutations are starting to gradually change the spike glycoprotein a little bit. So when we think about vaccines, what are the ways that we develop vaccines? So this is a schematic that looks at all the different types of vaccines that have been developed over time. And I'll just kind of walk through quickly just so you have a sense for all the different approaches to vaccines. So some of the early ones were toxoid vaccines like tetanus and diphtheria and pertussis, where you took something that the organism produced and purified that into a vaccine that then could be delivered. We have polysaccharide vaccines and polysaccharide conjugated vaccines for organisms like Haemophilus, meningococcus, and pneumococcus, where you take the coating of the organism and then link it to a protein to trick the immune system into responding. The old school version is whole pathogens, where you could just grow up a bunch of the organism, kill it, and then deliver it into people as a antigenic stimulation. Obviously, a lot of side effects as you're delivering the entire organism. And then the newer kind of more high-tech stuff, subunit vaccines, where you take just pieces of the viruses or the organisms. This is the classic approach to flu vaccines. Reassortant live vaccines, things like rotavirus vaccines, and then things that were considered sort of futuristic just a few years ago, which included mRNA vaccines, DNA plasmid vaccines, and other things. And it turns out those actually have ended up being some of the more reliable and trustworthy approaches to this program. All right, so let's walk through the challenges of developing a COVID vaccine in sort of bullet points. So one is, as I mentioned, that the natural immunity to coronaviruses appears to be short-lived, and that the antibodies that are developed don't really translate into full protection. So this would suggest that we actually need vaccines that are better than the wild type disease, and probably can't completely depend on herd immunity through natural infection as being a reliable way of getting up to the herd immunity we need to shut down transmission, because that natural herd immunity may not actually persist very long. We also needed to understand what are the markers of immunity. We realized that antibodies alone weren't the only answer, but it's also very hard to develop and measure T cells and T cell activity. And so when people were trying to figure out how to test these things, it basically came down to, do you ethically actually challenge people intentionally that have been vaccinated and give them an infection on purpose, knowing that we don't really know how to treat it? Or do we just wait out in society after we immunize people and see what efficacy looks like? And this is basically what ended up being decided as the only rational approach, was the good old-fashioned placebo-controlled trial. Again, discussions about what are the best target antigens. Right now, it's all about the spike glycoprotein, but I expect that'll change over time. And we already were talking about, way back in March, when I actually first made this slide, about how do we deal with the progressive mutations that we knew were going to occur, and how do we actually deal with the process of updating these vaccines? And then, even what's the best way of delivering these vaccines? You know, is intramuscular, the way we've done it for decades, the right way to go, knowing that there's actually very little immunologic cell material in those muscles, and maybe delivering subcutaneously or intradermally or intranasally might actually be a more appropriate way of getting good immunity. I mentioned this issue of making sure that we don't end up with enhanced disease after we vaccinate. Obviously, we're still trying to figure out how long does the immunity last, and are we going to need to periodically give boosters like we do for influenza? The big question of testing populations, you know, I think many of you in the cancer field are aware of this, that, you know, most things are initially tested in 18 to 45-year-old males, healthy males usually, many of whom are white. And understanding that the highest impact populations were in older individuals, people with comorbidities, and communities of color, really led to a major reanalysis of how we actually push the FDA, and how the FDA pushes investigators to investigate in a way that's actually more tangible for the populations that need vaccine the worst. How do we bypass the usual progressive, or what I call laborious, process of product development? You know, vaccines traditionally take about 8 to 10 years to come to market, of which about 4 to 5 years of it is actually bureaucratic analyses and processes. And how do we actually speed that up? How do we do mass manufacturing and delivery? That unfortunately has not gone well, and we still continue to struggle with that. And then obviously, how do we equitably distribute these vaccines in a way that gets to the areas that are most needed, as well as equitably representing all the communities that are being impacted. So those are the things that have kept me awake at night for most of the past year. Now, what are the things that allow me to get a decent night's sleep? Well, this has been an unprecedented global effort to develop a vaccine, and we've seen collaboration between companies as well as widespread sharing of information through all sorts of preprints. We have a lot of potential vaccine candidates and a lot of novel technologies that have been brought to bear, a lot of money being put into this, some element of national competition and racing to be the first ones to have vaccine available, both for our own countries, but also for less resourced countries. A lot of novel approaches to research and development and production. And then the fact that there actually had been previous efforts to develop vaccines for previous coronaviruses that were still on the shelf and could be kind of dusted off and put back to work. Again, and then these novel approaches to clinical studies and how do you actually involve much broader populations to really represent the communities that are going to need the vaccines first. This is a map of an open source shareware that basically shows you all the places where there are various aspects of this process happening. And I think it's been really exciting to see how basically the biotech industries, as well as many national governments, have really put so many resources into trying to develop vaccines as quickly as possible. And as you're all well aware, these things do need to march through the typical development and approval process as they move from phase 1, where the initial dosing is worked out and the initial side effects are appreciated, into phase 2, where we see in larger populations how the immune system responds and get a better idea about what short-term side effects look like, and then eventually into the phase 3 studies to really get a sense for how effective these things are before they are licensed. Now, that just wasn't going to work in the setting of a worldwide pandemic where we've had, over 100 million cases worldwide, over 2 million deaths, and here in the United States, over 25 million cases and over 400,000 deaths. And so this was published very early in the pandemic in the New England Journal with the proposal that instead of going through this very laborious and sequential process, eventually leading to licensure, which then leads to the upscaling of manufacturing abilities and commercial production, that instead, while there would be no suspension of the usual processes for the clinical evaluation, that Operation Warp Speed and other programs around the world would basically remove the financial disincentive for a lot of these companies by paying for the manufacturing development and scale up, so that when these things did reach the point of being able to be approved for emergency authorization, that at least the idea was that large-scale manufacturing would be shortly behind. That shortly, unfortunately, has become a little bit more extended than people had hoped. But nonetheless, having vaccines already available and having been administered to over 20 million people within a year of the start of this pandemic is still pretty remarkable. I should mention that the review process has been really novel as well. And one of the things that we all had to recognize was that no vaccine ever in the history of vaccinology has ever been approved under an emergency use authorization. While there are plenty of drugs that have reached that status, that's just never happened with vaccines. And so FDA did a lot of soul searching and issued what they called the playbook back in early September, that basically laid out what the legal, regulatory, and policy frameworks were going to be for this idea of EUA. And the idea was basically that since this was both a novel approach as well as vaccines being given to healthy people, and the issues of vaccine hesitancy and reassuring vaccine safety, meant that the EUA standards for these vaccines are actually much higher than they are for most of the drugs that have ever been approved under an EUA. And in fact, the EUA requirements basically match what the European Union full licensure requirements are, which is why most of us are predicting that within a few months after each of the EUAs are issued for these vaccines, we would likely see a full BLA, a full biological license, issued by the FDA, because the standards required for an EUA were really set so high. Now, that's unfortunately been not clearly messaged to the public, and a lot of them think that not only have, because of the speed of this, that things have been shortcut, when in fact it's really just been adding efficiencies. But that's been an issue as we've tried to share these things with people. All right, now let's move on to the vaccines. And as I mentioned, well over 200 vaccines are in various stages of development. I checked this morning, this is from the World Health Organization, 173 vaccines are in preclinical development, and 63 different vaccines are in some stage of clinical testing already. And this is a long list, and you can certainly look at this website yourself at the WHO, but these are all the different approaches to vaccines that are being used. And you can see that most of these are approaches that have never been used previously for successful vaccines. This is from the New York Times from a couple of days ago, where they track kind of where things are with all these vaccines that are in the clinical stages. And you can see that by their count, 38 are in stage 1, 24 stage 2, 20 in stage 3. 8 have actually been approved at various levels worldwide. 2 have been approved here fully by EUA in the United States. And then 3 vaccines have been abandoned. I think some of you saw that the Merck company has actually abandoned 2 more vaccines just in the last couple of days. Now, the U.S. approach to this, as with everything, was unique. And while there are this many vaccines out there in the wild in various stages, the Operation Warp Speed folks basically threw all their chips in with 10 companies, with 10 models that they sort of looked at as all having some viability. And so you can see that the ones that are furthest along, Moderna and Pfizer, with this mRNA technology, which was actually originally designed to be pandemic responsive. And so that was part of the reason that those are by far the first ones out of the gate and have been the most successful, at least at reaching the stage of being able to deliver them. Those that are kind of bringing up slightly behind are the AstraZeneca and Janssen vaccine, which was bought by Johnson & Johnson. And these are both an adenovirus, non-replicating viral vectors, both of them kind of slowly marching along towards submission of their data. I'm anticipating that Johnson & Johnson will actually probably be first, and that AstraZeneca, which has been approved in a couple other countries, continues to have some issues with their clinical trials, but will eventually reach the point of approval. Moderna and Pfizer look like they're about 95% effective at preventing hospitalizations and severe illness. The Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine is probably somewhere on the order of about 65 or 70%. And we're still waiting for the Johnson & Johnson data, which will be unblinded and made public in the next few weeks. And then coming up behind those, Novavax, which has completed their phase 2 enrollment and is moving ahead. Sanofi and GSK have been working together, but have had issues with their vaccine. And so actually in Europe, Sanofi is actually going to start producing the Pfizer vaccine because none of their plants are being used since there's this lagging behind. As I mentioned, Merck has abandoned their vaccines. And then there's a couple others that are really in sort of early stages. So this is, part of the issue here in the United States is that the previous administration basically kind of went all in with their chips on a small number of companies. Whoops. This is kind of the global look at things. And you can see that while there's a few of these US vaccines that have reached phase 3, there's a whole bunch more out there, including Russian and Chinese vaccines, as well as a vaccine developed actually by a company owned by a University of Wisconsin graduate, Krishna Ella at Bharat Biotech. And so there are more and more vaccines actually showing up from other countries, and there will be many more coming in the future. So there's going to be a worldwide sort of rush to develop vaccines, and it's going to be a little challenging to keep track of them all, which is, I guess, why you've got me, because this is kind of what I do all the time. And so there's been basically every model that we've mentioned, and then some that are going to gradually move into clinical trials. Briefly, just to mention the cold chain issues that I know people have been so concerned about. The Pfizer vaccine in being developed as an mRNA vaccine, which are incredibly unstable molecules, was developed in a way that did require it to be kept at ultra cold. But I remind people that those are the same temperatures that we ship ice cream and all your Omaha steaks at the holidays. So while everybody made a big deal about it, it wasn't as big a deal, I think, as people were making it out to be. Moderna vaccine also requires cold chain, but that's basically similar to what we already do with chickenpox and measles, mumps, rubella vaccines. And then more and more of the other vaccines that are coming along a little more slowly are basically on the order that we keep most other vaccines at relatively low but stable temperatures. Oops, sorry about that. And then finally, just thinking about sort of where we allocate these vaccines. This is a book by William Fogey back from the smallpox eradication fight. And I always kind of think about this quote when we think about vaccine allocation. If a house is on fire, no one wastes time putting water on nearby houses just in case the fire spreads. They rush to pour water where it will do the most good. on the burning, excuse me, on the burning house. And, early on, there were a lot of different groups that came out with various models for how they thought allocation should work. This was one from the National Academies of Medicine and Science that focused on first responders and health workers, and then people with comorbidities leaving phase 2 to be the people that were considered essential workers. The American public actually, when they were polled recently and have been polled periodically, agreed with some of this, but actually disagreed with others. Healthcare workers and nursing home residents were clearly on the top of the list, and they sort of had a tie between first responders and people at high risk for comorbidities. People over 65, teachers, and essential workers sort of ended up kind of in the next tier for the general public. Sorry, I keep doing that. What's evolved gradually as the fall has gone on has been a little bit of a shift in that. And I think it was largely because when a lot of those initial programs were developed was when we had really done a nice job of flattening the curve between summer and people being willing to comply with safer at home orders and social distancing. As things opened up in the fall, and unfortunately as disease ran rampant again, this has been adjusted. I think still the consensus has been tier 1A being the healthcare professionals and people that are dying rapidly in long-term care facilities, but there was sort of a retooling of the idea of then putting essential workers ahead of over 65-year-olds and people with high-risk medical conditions. And obviously this has been met with great gnashing of teeth and consternation, because this is the population that is largely suffering from the disease, while this is the group that is at least on the front lines and being confronted and likely transmitting the disease. And so there was a lot of consternation about how this would go forward. Oops, this got out of order, but I'll talk about it now anyway. In talking about where patients like yours all would sit, the Vaccine Advisory Committee at NCCN, basically has pushed for patients with cancer to be prioritized for vaccination and should be immunized when vaccination is available, and acknowledges this sort of disconnect between do they fit into 1B or 1C, but recommending that vaccine be provided for people on active therapy, understanding they may not have adequate immune response, but something may be better than nothing, because the severity of disease in this population can be so great. There are reasons that you may want to discuss delaying or suspending vaccination for some of your patients. One would be during a recent exposure when they're in their quarantine period, so that they're not exposing health workers when they're being vaccinated. Others include a recent documented SARS-CoV-2 infection, because that can lead to more severe side effects from the vaccine, as well as giving people some immunity that would then free up vaccine for other individuals. So people have been talking about sort of somewhere in the 30 to 90 day range, depending on how severe their infection was, because the more severe infection would predict that they would have longer immunity, but also that immunity might lead to side effects that may happen a further period of time out from the infection. And then anybody that's had recent administration of monoclonal antibodies or COVID plasma, because that'll blunt the immune response. And then this idea of trying to avoid other vaccines within 14 days before or after, because of the issue of interference between vaccines during that immune response. And then the NCCN does recommend delaying at least 3 months following hematopoietic stem cell transplants or engineered cellular therapy, so that you can maximize vaccine efficacy, and obviously recommending household contacts and other caregivers be immunized as well. And then finally, just a little bit about vaccine acceptance, because this is where I would like to enlist you all as junior COVID vaccine rangers in trying to help people understand the processes, but also trying to reassure people that vaccines really are important. We saw very early in the pandemic during the lockdown phases that the objections to masks were very quickly translated over into objection to vaccines as well. And even 6 months before we had vaccines that were going to be on the horizon and available, there were already protests against vaccines. We now see continuation of that, with a real split in the United States population over willingness to be vaccinated, as well as obviously extensive distrust in communities of color for good reason. The AP-NORC group, and you can see these things and they update them periodically at apnorc.org, is the Associated Press has funded a public health research agency at the University of Chicago that periodically polls Americans about various health issues. And one of the things they've been doing is polling people about coronavirus vaccines. That's not my typo, that's theirs. And one of the first questions is, who do they trust with information about coronavirus vaccines? And I think it's been really very reassuring in many ways that despite all the political infighting and all the disputes in the public forum, that health professionals like yourselves are still considered by the American public as the most reliable source of information. Whether it's a great deal or a moderate amount, you can see that we are the ones that people actually are going to trust for their opinions on what they should do. Followed closely by our dear Tony Fauci. And remarkably, CDC and FDA and HHS have actually been able to reasonably well hold up their credibility, even under much of the backbiting and political infighting that happened along the way. I think FDA did themselves a favor by being adamant back in September that they were going to set very strict standards, and despite the political pressure being put on them to rapidly approve these things, that they were going to stick by their standards. And I think that's actually done us a world of good. WHO obviously has had questions, and deservedly so at some levels. And then you can see sort of where any political party, any pharmaceutical company, and the news media lie in being people that obviously are considered to have ulterior motives. The other thing that's been interesting about the public is that when AP NORC surveyed people in May versus December, there hasn't been as much of a shift in opinion as I think many people had considered there would be. And so when you look at people who have said they would not receive a vaccine, the reasons remain pretty stable, and they actually are almost identical to what we see with influenza vaccine objections, where people are concerned about the side effects, they're concerned about, the development approval process, they're concerned about getting infected from the vaccine, although that has gradually decreased. They're not concerned about getting seriously ill from coronavirus, also starting to diminish as more people know people. But still some people that don't think the outbreak is as serious as it seems to be. More people starting to believe the vaccines actually do work. And then, no matter what we do, we're never going to get rid of people that hate needles or think they're allergic to vaccines or don't think they have time. And then finally, looking at the different populations around the country who are planning or wanting to get vaccinated, we do see an ethnic disparity as well as an age disparity, where younger individuals are at least considerably less likely to be willing and interested in getting vaccines. And then obviously a partisan divide, interestingly, with the independents being those that are most likely to object to vaccines over both Democrats and Republicans. But I think we have seen a little bit of a shift. This is from the Kaiser Foundation that has showed that between December and now, there's a survey that came out over the last week, that as more people have been immunized, we're already seeing more people then being willing to get it as soon as they can, and fewer people wanting to wait and see how it's going. So I do think that there is some hope as we move forward. So to finish up, in the meantime, while we all wait for vaccines to gradually become available, from a cancer talking point standpoint, I think that health workers really do play a key role in building vaccine confidence, ensuring safety for your patients, and increasing your patients' comfort level with both medical appointments and how we give vaccines, because we've really figured out quite nicely how to give both flu and COVID-19 vaccines in a safe and socially distanced way, across the state and across the country, as well as making sure that all of your patients understand that the healthcare provider that they are identifying with is really the best person that knows them and can help them understand about these vaccines and where they fit into their treatment modalities. And for the time being, and probably the next 6 months until we have adequate vaccine supply for most of the general public, we need to continue to emphasize to all of our patients and our colleagues and friends, stay home if you're sick, continue to practice hand hygiene and physical distance, wearing masks consistently. Getting immunized against influenza, at least has helped stave off a second co-pandemic. And then for those that are really interested in getting vaccinated, if they have access to MyChart, making sure that their account is active and making sure that the electronic medical record is accurate with their healthcare provider for both phone and ideally getting people to create email addresses, because as the registries start to move forward and identifying and inviting people, that's the easiest and best way for these things to happen. So I'll stop there. I'm happy to take questions or comments and appreciate you guys paying attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Conway. That was super informative. For the Q&A session now, I'm actually going to hand it off to our partnership manager, Beth Brenner, to facilitate. So feel free to unmute your lines and ask questions or type them into the chat box. I'll hand it over to Beth.
Great. Thank you, Alex. And thank you, Dr. Conway. Fantastic information and so timely as the vaccination is rolling out and getting into communities. If you do have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box. We'll get them to them. But one I have heard frequently, Dr. Conway, is some of the hesitation in the vaccination and getting vaccinated is that it is not FDA approved yet. So do you mind just speaking to maybe what would be a response we could give, or how do we help reassure people that these vaccines are safe?
Yeah, I think it's a really important topic, Beth, and that's kind of why I tried to mention, and I always try to remind people that the standards for approval at the European Union FDA, which is probably the next most strict FDA on the planet, are basically what were used as the model for the EUA approval here in the United States. And so, they really, unlike a lot of drugs where they have approved, based on rather limited data, they really have actually required in the playbook that the FDA issued that the companies essentially do the studies exactly the way they do for every other vaccine. So the number of people that are enrolled is exactly the same, actually more in many cases than what are usually required for vaccine trials. The inclusion of other populations beyond the typical sort of healthy population also has helped kind of speed things up. The only thing that was really compromised was the long-term immunity component of it, in looking at how long does the immunity last. That's actually the thing that usually, besides the bureaucratic review processes, is usually the thing that slows vaccines down to the point where they're 6 or 8 years for approval. So I think everybody needs to sort of remember that the standards for EUA approval for these vaccines are almost identical to what they are for every other vaccine, with that just one exception of just not knowing how long the immunity is going to last and when we need boosters. But that's common for every vaccine. If you think about tetanus shots, we didn't know in the beginning that you needed one every 5 or 10 years. We didn't know that you would need Tdap boosters, periodically for some people. So that's something that's relatively common. So I would tell people that, the approval process for these is pretty similar and almost identical to how these things are usually approved.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Conway. We have a question regarding the Pfizer vaccine and the age. They have it listed as ages 12 to 85 versus what we've heard is the 16 and older. And just wondering if you wouldn't mind commenting or providing some thoughts on the age for vaccination.
Yeah, all of the companies are at different stages in moving into pediatric trials. So Pfizer has already moved into studies in 12 to 16-year-olds. With their vaccine, there's already approval for Moderna and Pfizer at 16 and 18. So the path to approval in children is initially to move into 12 to 16-year-olds in what are going to be called bridging studies, similar to what was done with HPV vaccine, where they just need to show immunity, but they don't actually have to show full efficacy in that age group. Then they move down to 5 to 12-year-olds, and then ultimately they'll move into younger individuals where they're probably going to need to actually figure out different doses. So that's why each of the trial ages are going to be different, and they change literally week by week.
Great, thank you. So we've heard a lot about the new variants of COVID that are out there, and that Moderna has said that their vaccine is effective against these new variants. Has there been any indication of that with the Pfizer vaccine?
Yeah, so I think these are all going to be constantly updated as new variants are identified. I think one of the things that's been unfortunate is that, I read something the other day that less than 0.5% of all the viruses identified have actually been had molecular typing done. And so unfortunately, I think what we've realized is that there are mutants all over the place, and they're constantly emerging, and we're only seeing kind of the tip of the iceberg. Moderna does seem to have good neutralizing activity, as does Pfizer, against the B117 mutant out of the UK. Moderna actually is going to announce, or already did announce, that their immunity is a little bit not quite as good for the South African mutant. What we're looking at is, when they're looking at these, is what's the neutralizing capacity of the antibodies that are developed. Remember, I said that not all the immunity is antibody mediated. Some of it's T cell mediated. So basically all they're doing is looking at antibodies and how tightly they bind to these new mutants. And so the B117 mutants that are the ones in the UK, both of these, the antibodies produced by these vaccines, bind pretty well, a little less tightly than they did to the original strains that were being used, but as far as anybody can tell, good enough. But one of the things that already is going to happen, and this is going to need to happen reliably, is that the good thing about mRNA vaccines is they can be modified really quickly. So both Moderna and Pfizer are already working on modified versions of their vaccines to include better immunity against more mutants as they come along. And that's exactly what they were designed to be done. You don't need to grow up a whole organism and make mutants of the organism to make new virus. You just literally go in and tweak the mRNA and then you mass produce that. So we're going to see a lot of this kind of discussion. And I'm not going to be surprised at all if ultimately we do need boosters of these vaccines, and that for the mRNA vaccines, I wouldn't be surprised at all if the boosters are a little bit different each year, similar to what we do for flu vaccines.
Great, thank you. Oh, so, you know, as we've talked about COVID and seeing disparities as with the disease, but I think there's now a concern maybe that we're going to begin to see some disparities as the vaccination rolls out, in particular on how the healthcare organizations have been creating what they see as a technology disparity, where people with MyChart or emails receive the vaccines between those that might not have smartphones or internet access. Do you have any thoughts on maybe how we can help either in a healthcare system or in a community for those that might be kind of falling into the technology disparity?
Yeah, it's a great question and a real challenge. You know, here in Dane County, at least, there's a whole diversity and inclusion medical group that's been working on that very issue. And you know, people are well aware that both older individuals and individuals from some communities of color, you know, may lack that kind of technology. And so there's been a lot of attention and a lot of groups working on trying to do outreach into those communities to figure out ways to make sure that they don't get missed. And in fact, you know, much of the recommendations we've made at the state level for implementation has been to use the social vulnerability index as a way of identifying populations that should be prioritized, partially because those are the ones that are harder to reach. So, you know, every organization should have a diversity and inclusion officer, and within the IT group, people working on those very issues. So there's going to be, you know, as we get more vaccines available, a lot more public marketing. The Ad Council is already working in those areas to try to encourage people. There are ultimately, the state has signed an agreement, and there will be a statewide registry supposedly that will be going live at some point. But there's going to have to be outreach into those populations to help them get signed up so they don't get missed. But you know, this is a million-dollar question, and obviously one that we're all well aware of, especially given all the racial injustice awareness that has come up in 2020.
Great, thank you. A question or a comment, kind of stepping away from vaccinations for a minute. As we know, as people are getting vaccinated, we still need to social distance, we still need to wear a mask. And I think Chris has stated he is frustrated, as I think many of us are, that we might have a legislature today that is looking to overturn our mask mandate. And he's just seeking clarification. I don't know if you could speak to this, Mr. or Dr. Conway. Is this really what could look to happen today? Are we looking at today we could have an overturning of our mask mandate statewide?
Yeah, this is extraordinarily troubling, and in some ways, for those of us that have colleagues around the country, kind of embarrassing as well. You know, I mean, I won't get too high up onto my political soapbox, but you know, the states that have been reliably consistent in their messaging, and the countries that have been reliably consistent in their messaging, are the countries and the states that have actually been the most successful at controlling this. You know, I think one of the things that has reassured me a little bit about Wisconsin is that in most areas of the state, even without a statewide mandate, you know, the compliance has been reasonably good, but we've certainly seen pockets, and the pockets of the more severe outbreaks have been in those areas where less masking and less social distancing has been the practice. So it is extraordinarily troubling that, you know, as far as we can see, it shouldn't have to be an either or. Now, I know people are concerned about the economy and getting back to normality, but there's nothing quite as disruptive as returning to normality and normal behavior too quickly and then having everything explode in your face. I think one of the things we're really concerned about right now is that, you know, we finally weathered the holiday storm, and the numbers nationally do seem to be dropping relatively. In, you know, about 45 states seem to at least have had their curves drop, but that's the time to actually double down, because as we're seeing these more transmissible mutants starting to enter and be more present around the country, and knowing that people are frustrated with things and are going to stop complying, I think most of us are fearful of yet another very impactful surge just at the time when we're hopefully going to be starting to get vaccines more readily available. So, I encourage everybody through the professional societies to make your voices heard. The professional societies, especially up at the state legislature, are both respected and listened to. And while a lot of us individually, like to file our grievances and make ourselves heard, the professional societies in many ways are the ones that actually really are our best mouthpieces. I think that it's also important, though, when you're using those, to make sure you're sharing personal stories, especially about patients and the risks to patients. Those are the types of things that the legislators do respond to and seem to be the ones that we can at least get to kind of reconsider their positions. But yes, this is going to be, it's already been a mess in Wisconsin ever since the Supreme Court back in the fall overruled the governor's ability to even issue public health mandates. And this is sort of an ongoing version of that. But I encourage people to speak out and, send notes to your legislators, especially if you're from an area of the groups that have been supportive of removing the mask mandate.
Great, thank you. What is the likelihood that those severe immune responses will occur after future coronavirus challenges? Is there likely to be a difference between the modalities? Example, the mRNA versus the endovirus, et cetera.
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's part of the reason that, we couldn't just make vaccines, test them in people and see if they had antibodies the way a lot of people were pushing back over the summer and say, okay, good enough, let's get them out there. We had to really aggressively push back against both the president and some members of HHS, who basically just wanted the companies, once they could show that they could make antibodies against vaccines, and they were waving numbers around like, as long as they, 50% of the people get antibodies, that'll be good enough. We had to really convince them, especially those of us in pediatrics, that we needed to be absolutely sure that people, once they were infected, didn't get enhanced disease. And so, part of the roadmap that FDA laid out was, for most of the companies, they required about 30,000 enrollees. And then they set specific numbers. You had to have a certain number of people infected across the board before you can even unblind and see who was in the placebo and who was in the vaccine recipient situation. And then you had to follow them for some months afterwards. And so, Moderna and Pfizer vaccines started enrolling people way back in the beginning of the summer. And unfortunately, or fortunately, it was during a period of kind of a lull in cases around the United States. So only once the return to normal started in kind of middle of August and cases took off again, were we able to start accumulating enough cases in the vaccine programs. And what we've seen now, we've got people that are 5 months out from contracting disease that had received vaccine, is that there really is no signs of any enhancement. But I really encourage everybody, once you start vaccinating, to make sure you use whatever your patient safety network system is within your system to report side effects, but also to report cases of vaccinees who have actually developed disease. Those all can then go into the vaccine adverse events reporting system, the infamous VAERS system. And that's basically the way that FDA and the federal government will continue to follow these. I think you guys in cancer world, more than most of my colleagues, really understand the phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and phase 4 is probably one of the least appreciated phases of all of this, which is the post-licensure ongoing surveillance that happens. And so every vaccine that's approved, no matter whether it's EUA or a BLA, every vaccine, the companies are required to continue to do ongoing monitoring for safety and efficacy, essentially indefinitely. Usually 5 to 10 years is sort of when they kind of get off the hook. But the companies, have databases and registries for all of these things. And so anybody that's involved in vaccinating or in caring for patients, I always encourage people, it's better to report than not report. Even if you're not sure if a side effect was related to the vaccine, those things are all better to be reported than not, so that they can go into the databases and be investigated. The more we can all do to contribute to that data collection and allow that to be analyzed, we'll be able to continue to generate more and more reassurance. But at this point, we have seen, nothing that resembles enhanced disease or severe immune responses after infections. And that seems to hold up for at least the 4 vaccines that are closest to market at this point, the 2 mRNA vaccines and the 2 adenovirus vector-based vaccines from Janssen and from AstraZeneca.
Great, thank you. I will, if there's any additional questions, please put them in the chat. Otherwise, I just had one final thought. As you went through the presentation, it was encouraging to see the value that individuals are placing on their healthcare provider and professionals in getting vaccinated. Do you have any thoughts just of what we've learned from screenings, and in particular for you, what we've learned on HPV vaccinations, or anything of that value of the healthcare professional providing that recommendation may become critical as we try to get to herd immunity and we're trying to get more people vaccinated? Do you have any thoughts or comments to share, or resources that individuals could use to provide that education to their members or to their patients?
Yeah, Beth, that's a great question, and I'm glad you brought up our previous time working together around HPV, because I think we learned some important lessons there, and I think we're trying to repurpose those currently. There's a couple things that come to mind. Come to mind quite quickly. One is to be proactive about this. That even though your patient populations may be some time off from being vaccinated, but starting to ask them what their thoughts are early. And bringing it up. One of the things we talk about when we talk about vaccine acceptance is the normalization process. Is that if it's the norm in your community or in your networks to be vaccinated, you're a lot more likely to be vaccinated. If you hang out with people that are opposed to vaccines, or if it seems to be something that's an oddity, you're less likely to do it. And so I think that if we can start these conversations early with our patients, give them chances to ask questions and encourage them to read more about these things and come back with more questions, you'll be a lot more, you'll be greasing the skids, as we say, ahead of time, so that it's not a flurry of calls and issues. There's a ton of resources out there. To be honest, I think the CDC has actually done a really very nice job of consistently trying to update their pages and their information. They've repurposed an entire team of people. And I think they probably have the most reliable and consistent messaging. Certainly there are, for unique small populations, there are things that will uniquely address specific questions, but CDC has been probably the most reliable. The other one that I use and I work with quite often is the Immunization Action Coalition, which is www.immunize.org. And it's an NGO centered in Minnesota, but basically all of us that work in vaccine education and vaccine advocacy develop and post materials there that are readily available, including PowerPoints for people if you need to give talks on these things, Q&A sheets, and all those kinds of things. So I think that's probably the other most useful site that people can find. They have a whole COVID-19 vaccine webpage that has links to all the good CDC sites, as well as a lot of Q&A things that you can share. So I think those are probably the two most reliable as sort of across the board. But encourage people to, if your patients aren't bringing it up with you, bring it up with them. Ask them what their thoughts are, what they're thinking about, how eager they are, and try to get people to at least be thinking about these ahead of time, so that they've asked their questions, and as soon as their point in line comes up, hopefully they can then act on it. One of our issues in distribution, to be honest, has been not only the slow delivery of vaccine from the federal government, but the delays after people receive their invitations and the time they take before they respond. And so when people are frustrated that, the state's been allocated X amount of vaccine, but only half of that has been delivered, part of the problem is that at each of the health systems level, once we get a shipment of vaccine in, then we invite the next group of people, but then we have to sort of wait for them to respond and make their appointments before we can move ahead. We made the mistake of sort of just jumping ahead and inviting too many people. And then Christmas week, we ended up having to reschedule a couple hundred people because we didn't get enough vaccine in. So most systems are generally waiting until they actually have vaccine in hand. But then it's a bummer when people take weeks to respond as they make up their mind. So encouraging people to sort of have their mind made up ahead of time. The faster they sort of move themselves out of the queue, the more people we can invite and keep things moving.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Conway. That was it for the questions, but I have to say thank you so much for all this information. I don't know all of us want to just bring you with us as we get the resistance and we get the questions. Such helpful information. So Alex, I will turn it back over to you to finish out the webinar.
Thank you very much. We just have a few closing items we'd like to highlight. For more information too, you can check out our COVID and cancer webpage. I believe Sarah just dropped that link in the chat box. You can easily navigate to this on our website as well. We've got social media toolkits, links to research articles, all of our past COVID-19 webinar recordings, and some fact sheets for local governments and businesses. And we also wanted to highlight some of those recommendations that Dr. Conway talked about earlier in his presentation from the National Comprehensive Cancer Network on cancer patients and being vaccinated for COVID. So we have this link dropped right there if you would like to read more on that. And then finally, we want to highlight a new resource that we teased a couple months ago that is now ready for use on our website called Cancer Tests and Screenings, How to Safely Get Tested for Cancer During COVID-19. This is a great fact sheet to use with patients to promote, to let people know that it is safe to return to healthcare settings for cancer screenings. And then finally, a plug for our webinar next month on February 11th. We will be joined by the Executive Director of the National LGBT Cancer Network, who is going to share tools and strategies for improving outcomes for LGBTQ+ populations across the cancer continuum. And before you leave today, if you wouldn't mind taking a quick evaluation poll that should just pop up on your screen now, it would be greatly appreciated. And once again, thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you will join us next month on February 11th. Take care, everyone.